It was just another night shift for Brian, a college kid trying to scrape together enough cash to cover his tuition by working at a morgue in the 1960s. The job was, for the most part, boring, quiet, a little creepy, sure, but Brian had been at it long enough that the cold, clinical feel of the place didn't bother him anymore. He'd learned to shut that part of his brain off, handling bodies, working in near silence. It just became routine. But this night was different. Brian was supposed to show the new guy, Paul, this kid who looked like he was barely out of high school, the ropes. Paul seemed eager enough, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. Not that Brian could blame him. The morgue, with its rows of lifeless bodies and harsh white lights, was a tough place to get used to. After giving Paul the basic rundown, it was time to move a body. Simple enough. The body in question was an elderly man who died a few days back. Heart attack. The kind of death that didn't leave much to question. By now, rigor mortis had set in, so the body was stiff, hard to handle. Brian instructed Paul on how to help him transfer the man from the storage unit to the gurney, then down the hallway to the examination room. As they wheeled the body along the dimly lit corridor, Paul kept trying to make conversation. Nervous chatter, really. His voice wavered, and he kept glancing at the corpse under the sheet, like he expected it to jump up or something. Brian had to stifle a laugh. He remembered those first shifts, the uneasy feeling, the nerves that hit you when you were still new to death. But after a while, you just got used to it. Or so he thought. The hallway was dead quiet, the only sound coming from their footsteps and the squeak of the gurney's wheels against the tile floor. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered on and off, making weird, jumpy shadows in the corners. Despite himself, Brian felt something, a prickling on the back of his neck. Something wasn't quite right. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, the sheet over the body shifted, and the corpse started to sit up. Not in a quick, jerky way. It was slow, deliberate, like something was pushing it from inside. Paul let out a scream, a loud, high-pitched one that echoed down the hall. He stumbled back, eyes wide, as the corpse kept rising. The sheet slid off, revealing the pale, slack face of the old man. His eyes were empty, staring straight ahead, as though he wasn't really there. But his body kept leaning forward, as if it might stand up at any second. Brian? He froze. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The whole room felt heavy, like the air had thickened, and the flickering light only made things worse, casting eerie shadows across the dead man's face. And then, just like that, the corpse slumped back down. It was over. The body just lay there again, motionless, as if nothing had happened. But Brian couldn't shake it. He couldn't unsee it. A body, dead for days, had sat up right in front of him. Paul bolted, his footsteps pounding down the hallway as he ran for the exit, his voice trailing off in a jumble of panicked words. Brian stood there a second longer, staring at the corpse, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Finally, snapping out of it, Brian ran after Paul. They both ended up outside the morgue, pale as ghosts, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Paul managed, his voice shaking. Did it just sit up?" Brian, still trying to wrap his head around it, could barely speak. He knew the stories. He'd heard about the post-mortem spasms. Sometimes bodies twitch. They can even sit up if the muscles contract in just the right way. It was science. There was nothing supernatural about it. just leftover nerve activity. But even knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying. Yeah, it's just a muscle spasm, Brian muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. Happens sometimes. Rare, but it happens. Paul shook his head, still pale. I don't care, man. I'm not going back in there. The rest of the shift felt different. The morgue had always been a quiet, sterile place. But now, every creak, every flicker of the lights felt loaded with meaning, like the dead were restless. Paul quit the next day. Brian couldn't blame him. And even though Brian kept working there, that night stayed with him, haunted him for years. No amount of science could make what they saw any easier to explain. Sure, it was just a post-mortem spasm, just muscles doing their thing after death. But that image, the old man, sitting up, staring at nothing, it was burned into Brian's mind. Years later, Brian would tell the story to friends, laugh it off as some weird thing that happened back when he was working in the morgue. But deep down, he never shook it. The morgue stopped feeling like just a place of work. The dead, once just objects, started to feel like they were watching him. Even now, in the middle of the night, sometimes Brian wakes up, sweating, heart racing, that same scene playing over in his mind. The dead man slowly sitting up, those hollow eyes staring straight ahead, as though he knew something Brian didn't. Because sometimes, even when science has an explanation, things happen that defy it. And that night in the morgue, Brian came face to face with one of those moments, and he's never forgotten it. For a period of time, I dated a girl who was an apprenticing funeral director and embalmer. Part of her scope also included preparing funeral documents, including graphics, photo rolls, guest books, etc. We had plans to hang out one night, but she was working late and particularly stressed about a service she was preparing. So I surprised her at the funeral home with a pizza. She was the only one working in the building that night. We went into the upstairs office to enjoy our pizza, and then I was going to leave to let her get back to it. As we were eating, she mentioned the person she was preparing was very adamant they did not want a service or memorial, but the family was pushing for one anyway. She was having a lot of troubles getting the documents together. Things not saving or printing correctly, files corrupted, etc. Which was unusual since she's done this work a lot before, and she was pretty stressed about it. When I came downstairs to leave, all the lights in the funeral home were on, which was pretty weird. Did we turn them on and forget? Did someone come into the building? Since she was alone, we figured we'd do a walkthrough of the building, just to make sure no one entered. The front door was unlocked, and it was after hours. It was locked when I showed up, but she couldn't remember if she locked it when I came in. Too excited by pizza. We both had this uneasy feeling, and room by room, we swept the building to make sure no one was there and turned off the lights. Literally every single light was on, even closets and shit, and that was very weird. The last area was in the back and included the crematorium, the embalming or prep room, a storage area for materials, and a loading dock. You didn't have clear line of sight from the doorway. In front of you was the material storage with the loading dock around the corner, out of sight from the door, the embalming rooms to the left, and the crematorium adjacent to that. The body of the person who did not want this service was in the prep room. I cleared the storage area, and then walked with her to the embalming rooms and stood by the door while my girlfriend went into the embalming room to check it. No joke. The second she turned off the lights in the room where the body was kept, a radio at full volume turned on in the loading dock. I was so uneasy, and the sound was so unexpected, I almost shit my pants. I ran to kill the radio and clear the loading dock, and no one was there. We turned off the rest of the lights, and I got out of there, while she stayed behind to finish her work for another hour or two. That night, my girlfriend firmly believed the spirit of the person who did not want this service performed was there that night, and the source of the lights, the radio, and her troubles with building the document package. I don't really believe in spiritual things or ghosts or anything like that, but I have no other way to explain what happened that night. It was weird, and still creeps me out when I think about it. Working the night shift at the morgue was supposed to be peaceful. It was part of the appeal when I took the job. Just me, the stillness, and a few bodies resting silently on the steel tables. I liked the quiet, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the isolation. No distractions, just calm. Most people would be unnerved by the idea, but for me, it was a sanctuary. But tonight was different. Something felt off. It started with the bodies. There were 3 in the freezer. A car accident victim, an elderly woman who passed in her sleep, and an unknown man brought in earlier that evening. He was listed as a Carl, no ID, no records. The paramedics had found him near the riverbank, unresponsive, but with no clear cause of death. Around midnight, I was finishing up my report when I heard a faint noise. It was subtle, a soft thump coming from the cold room. At first, I dismissed it. Old buildings make noises, and the pipes in the morgue were notorious for creaking at odd hours. But the thumping continued, growing louder, more insistent. I stood, feeling a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking from the inside of one of the freezer units. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the cold room. My heart pounded against my chest as I opened the heavy door. The icy air hit me like a slap in the face. I walked down the rows of storage drawers, each one labeled with the name or number of its occupant. And then I saw it. The drawer where the Carl lay was slightly ajar, just enough to let a wisp of cold air escape. I froze, gripping the handle of the flashlight so hard, my knuckles turned white. The thumping had stopped, but now I was standing inches away from the source. With shaking hands, I pulled the drawer out fully. There he was, the Carl, lying on the metal slab, pale and still. But something was wrong. His eyes were open. I stumbled back, the flashlight clattering to the floor. My brain raced for explanations. I knew what rigor mortis was, how the muscles sometimes twitch after death. But this was different. His eyes had been closed when they brought him in. I was sure of it. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard another sound, a whisper. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. It sounded like someone struggling to breathe, shallow and ragged. Instantly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Against every instinct screaming at me to back away, I found myself leaning closer to the body. The whispering cut off, replaced by a low, guttural moan. I stumbled back, feeling the panic rising in my chest. I had seen strange things in this place, but this was something else, something unnatural. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. The room plunged into complete darkness, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I fumbled for my flashlight, fingers trembling as I tried to get it to work. When the light finally clicked on, I pointed it toward the body. But the slab was empty. Carl was gone. My mind raced, trying desperately to make sense of what had just happened. Corpses don't just get up and walk away. That's impossible. But as I swung the flashlight across the room, my eyes caught on something. Wet footprints, leading away from the table. They were heading straight for the door. I followed them, my heart hammering in my chest. The morgue was deathly silent, but I could feel it, the sensation of being watched. I reached the door and yanked it open, my flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the hallway's thick darkness. And there, at the far end of the corridor, stood Carl. His back was to me, his head tilted at a disturbingly unnatural angle. I swallowed hard and called out, my voice shaking. "Sir?" He didn't answer. He just started moving, his legs jerking forward in a strange, stiff gait. It was like his body didn't remember how to function, like his joints had forgotten their purpose. I watched as he staggered down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows ahead. My legs felt heavy, but somehow I forced myself to move. I kept my distance, my heart pounding in my ears as I rounded the corner where I had last seen him. The hallway was empty now, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant. And something else, something metallic. I approached the end of the hall, spotting the double doors leading to the basement. They were open, gently swinging on their hinges. My stomach twisted. The basement. That's where we stored the old equipment, the unused freezers, and the bodies when the cold room was too full. It was also where the power tended to short out, plunging the entire space into suffocating darkness. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the doors and started down the stairs. The basement was quiet, except for the occasional drip from a leaking pipe somewhere above. My flashlight beam flickered, casting erratic shadows along the damp walls. Then I saw him. Carl was slumped against the far wall, his body contorted in a way that no living person could manage. His eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. I froze. My flashlight shook in my hands, the beam trembling. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run, but my feet were cemented to the floor. Then, as I stared in disbelief, his mouth opened. A long, rattling breath wheezed out, followed by a wet, gurgling sound. And that's when I saw the blood. It was pooled beneath him, thick and dark, soaking into the concrete. But it wasn't fresh. It looked old, congealed, like it had been there for days, maybe longer. None of it made any sense. Carl had been dead for hours by the time they brought him in. There was no way he could still be alive. It wasn't until much later, after the police had come and gone, that I learned the truth. Carl had a condition, something called Lazarus syndrome. It's a rare phenomenon where a person's heart stops, sometimes for a long period, only to restart spontaneously. In Carl's case, it had been hours, long enough for him to be declared dead and sent to the morgue. But his heart had restarted, briefly, just long enough for him to leave his mark.